Rob.
Okay, well, I need to start by warning anyone here who attended my talk on parish plans at the BCS conference event that there is necessarily going to be a degree of duplication. I aim to explore in this talk the extent to which Scotland was different, but I can't do that without making clear what we're talking about. So if you were at BCS and remember it all, then by all means go and make yourself a cup of coffee. Now, I want to introduce a conceptual distinction that I have never seen made, perhaps because I haven't read the right sort of theoretical stuff. Prior to the 19th century, most maps were of an entity surrounded by other entities. For example, think of the county maps of England. Here we have Speed's map of Berkshire. The detail is limited to Berkshire itself, plus places within a mile or so of the county boundary. Berkshire is named in the title, so it doesn't need to appear on the face of the map, but the names of adjoining entities are given in fancy script alongside each section of common boundary, like part of Oxford, Buckinghamshire, etc. Sometimes the entity concerned might be quite small. Plan of an estate belonging to X in the parish of Y in the city of Lincoln might only show a couple of burgage plots, but in the same way, the detail will be limited to X's property, and around its boundary, the names of adjoining owners will be noted. The Ordnance Survey introduced a new sort of map, a rectangle, arbitrary in its positioning, with detail filled to the edges. I live in sheet 121 of the Land Ranger series. If I drive 10 miles eastwards, I know I shall move on to sheet 122. If I go west of Newark, I shall need 120. This approach goes right back to the survey's first publication, the 4 old series sheets of Essex. Actually, it wasn't quite as straightforward as that, because mapping only ran seamlessly across the Scottish border from the second half of the 20th century. But that was because Scotland was on a different projection. Following the return of surveyors from Ireland in the 1840s, there was a move to change the basic scale of survey for England and Scotland from 1 inch to 6 inches to the mile, as I'm sure all of you will know. There was then the Battle of the Scales, which was resolved by settling on 25 inches to the mile as the general scale of survey. This may sound odd as a resolution, but there was logic to it. The larger scale would answer more purposes, notably serving as an estate map, while costing not much more than a 6-inch survey. Of course, providing estate maps was a benefit that accrued particularly to landowners. It also took away a good proportion of the business of private surveyors. The Ordnance were somewhat inclined to play down this function and to emphasize the use of the survey for public purposes, like rating. The 1 inch, as has been observed, ran in a series of regular sheets across as much of England as had been published. The 6 inch, started in the 1840s, likewise ran as a regular series of rectangular sheets stopping at county boundaries for the same reason as at the Scottish border, a change of projection. In all the papers put forward, there was no suggestion that a 25-inch survey would be any different, except that possibly demand might be so low that it might be more economical to make tracings available rather than print sheets lithographically. In the event, just about every sheet was printed. Mountain and moorland continued to be surveyed at the 6-inch scale, and that is the normal cause of gaps in 25-inch coverage. It must therefore have come as a shock to purchasers to find that the sheets they were interested in might look like this. A small part of the parish being depicted, and a great deal of blank space. Blank not because it was yet to be surveyed or on a different projection, but merely because it lay in a different parish. To take a somewhat extreme case, the well-prepared purchaser who turned up at his map agent knowing that he wanted Devon sheet 123.8, was liable to be asked, do you want the Compton Gifford portion of 1238, sir? The Stoke Damerel portion, the East Stonehouse portion, the Penny Cross portion, the Plymouth St Andrew portion, or the Charles the Martyr portion? Such a user might well feel that Thomas Colby deserved martyrdom for introducing so inconvenient a system. Many map librarians feel the same way. So how did this come about? Part of the answer arose when I was trying to work out the exact specification for these parish sheets. And one key was the naming of adjoining parishes. On the slide, you should be able to make out a dagger almost at the top of the boundary. Here is a closer view. The dagger indicates the point at which the neighbouring parish changes. To the west of the dagger, the boundary of Inch, which is the parish here, is common with Forg. This is indicated not by fancy lettering on the face of the map, but by naming the parish in the margin. In this case, the upper margin was used, don't ask me why, just to the right of the title, a juxtaposition which must have confused some users. If we want to know what the adjoining parish is to the south of the dagger, we need to look in the bottom margin. At least here, the position name Salmond seems more natural. In the next sheet to the south, the name Kilsalmond appears in the top margin, but the next sheet has it in large open capitals on the face of the map. Below that name, we have an inset. When the area of a parish on a particular sheet was so tiny as to risk provoking a riot if the survey had attempted to charge for so large an area of blank space, the extract might be placed within the blank space on another of the parish sheets, where possible an adjoining one. So what is the adjoining parish to Inch on sheet 3515, the inset bit? Does the name in open capitals apply both to 3514 and to 3515? No. The inset follows the marginal convention, but because insets do not have margins, the name does not appear at all. The user is expected to note that the adjoining parish continues unchanged to one of the adjoining sheets, or both adjoining sheets, and to consult one of them. In this case, one of the adjoining sheets is on the same piece of paper, but it might not be. So the answer might be on a sheet the user has not bought. There seems to be an attitude here that if the user is such a cheapskate as not to have bought the full set of sheets of the parish, he deserves no particular consideration. Continuing southwards, the next sheet beyond 3515 is 44.3. The common boundary with Kilsalmond continues, and the name is placed in the upper margin. Upper margin? Why can't I see it? Well, that's just a statement. It is there in the upper margin. Towards the bottom, we have another dagger, and the neighbouring parish changes to Oyne, whose name is placed in the bottom margin. And again, you'll have to take that for granted. The next sheet, 44.7, appears as an inset. Here, the common boundary with Oyne continues, and this time the name appears in open capitals within the inset. How convenient that it is so short a name. This inset is placed on 44.6, where, as you see, there is only a short length of common boundary with Oyne before a dagger appears, and the name is placed in the right-hand margin. I must observe that the recent scanning by NLS of all the parish sheets that had previously been left unscanned because a combined sheet was available has been an absolute boon. One can almost go so far as to say that if a Scottish sheet is not on their website, that is because it was never published. But how are we to explain this erratic alternation between placing the names of adjoining parishes in the margin and setting them in open capitals on the face of the map? The answer appears to be that every adjoining parish appears once and once only on the face of the map, about midway along the common boundary. If you were to take the inch sheets, trim off the margins and mount them on linen in the appropriate position, and also remove the insets from their parent sheets and mount them in their proper positions, you would have a splendid map of the parish with the name of each adjoining parish appearing just once at about the midpoint of its boundary. And that, I would argue, is the reason for this erratic alternation between two different ways of showing adjoining parishes. The indexed map on the book of reference gives you a simplified view of how it would look. Incidentally, note that the northwest edge of the parish is bordered by a different county, Banffshire, or rather a detached part of Banffshire. Here it is the county name shown along the common boundary, and the changes of county are marked by daggers with a double crossbar. Now, there is one problem with this splendid map of inch you will have created. It will be 12 feet high and 10 feet wide. But all you need is a decent-sized hall or ballroom to hang it in and a set of library steps so that you can inspect it. Had the parish you were interested in been Elgin, the map would have been similar in height, but some 25 feet wide. Even for the more manageable parishes in England, the result would not be insignificant in size. My own parish would be 3'6" high by 8 foot wide. It would be possible to mount this in dissected form so that it would fold to a folio volume, but I would still need to clear space on top of my map chests if I wanted to inspect even a portion of it. This raises the question of whether such mounted parish maps were ever actually produced. The Ordnance Survey would not produce them itself. It left the mounting of maps to the private sector. And I've never seen such a map myself, or almost never. The parish of Kingswear in Devon consists of two separate portions on the north bank of the Dart estuary, entirely surrounded by Brixham. Conveniently, they fit nicely on Devon 128.13. If you look at it on the NLS website, you will find it has been provided with the fancy title the survey considered appropriate for such parish maps. Because it all fitted on one sheet, the survey was able to produce this bijou specimen of its grand idea. Had the only effect of this infatuation with parish maps been this quirk in the way that adjoining parishes were shown, it might be dismissed as ill-judged but harmless. The real problem was the effect on area computation.
While I'm here, I'm showcasing technologies that take waste and break it down in a non-chemical way, and we recycle it and we make a garment out of it.
There are still companies selling £3 bikinis, £5 t-shirts. Should that be allowed? Should we ban that?
Well, ultimately, yes, of course it should be allowed. I mean, I think anyone that is informed.
May I continue? Right. The rules for numbering were quite complicated, but the first is the most important. Parcels were defined by the parish, not by the sheet. The latter is a lot easier to operate and has been the case since the National Grid Survey commenced after the Second World War. The number of each parcel appears just once on the face of the map, as near as is practicable to the middle of the parcel, however one defines that. If a parcel extends across a sheet edge, the sheet that can claim the middle bears the parcel number on the face of the map, and the other one has it in the margin. To take a particular case, every sheet corner necessarily lies in some parcel or other. That parcel will appear on one of the sheets on the face of the map, and on the other 3 sheets sharing that corner, it will appear in the margin. I hope people have grasped that. Now, the 5th rule there seems harmless enough, but it means the draftsman cannot allocate numbers until he knows where the midpoint of each parcel is going to lie. Since all the parcels on one sheet should be numbered before moving on to the next, it is absolutely essential to have decided where each midpoint lies before starting to number them. If you were a private surveyor numbering the fields on a farm survey, this would be easy enough to do, and you might ask what I'm making such a fuss about. The trouble was that the Ordnance Survey numbered everything, including roads. A road was treated as a linear thing, none of this French business of having an N32 bis, but many of them would extend from one edge of the parish to the opposite edge. I've seen one that extended over 7 different sheets. The other nasty type of parcel is rocky coast. It's not uncommon for a coastal parcel to extend across 3 sheets, and because of the rock drawing, it's difficult to see where the parcel stops. Overall, I don't see how the numbering process could have been done unless the area computation branch was provided with its own copy of each sheet. They could then outline the boundaries of each parcel in red ink, say, and then mark the middle of each parcel with a green dot. Only then could numbering and area measurement proceed without error. Now, the benefit of these rules was that if you trimmed all the sheets and mounted them as a parish map, everything would be done in the best approved fashion. Every parcel number would appear just once on the face of the map in the middle of its respective parcel. The join between sheets would not be so much seamless as non-existent so far as map content was concerned. Tremendously elegant, but achieved at a substantial cost for the sake of a map that was almost never produced. Perhaps the need for revision was such a distant prospect in the 1850s that no one was thinking about it. Nevertheless, the consequence of parcel numbering in this way was that one could not revise a single sheet by itself. The whole parish would have to be renumbered and relithographed. Perhaps that was accepted and regarded as tolerable in the 1850s. The trouble was that 20 years later, when publication was by combined sheets, it meant you had to redo all the sheets that contained a portion of the parish, and unless you were willing to redraw those sheets while revising only part of them, you had to revise all the parishes that adjoined the parish you had revised. In fact, the only tidy form of revision was to do a whole county, which of course is how revision was done until the First World War. That this rigidity was unavoidable is shown by the Clitheroe experiment in the mid-1880s. This was primarily conducted to assess the effectiveness of replotting Lancashire and Yorkshire material at the 25-inch scale. But a secondary objective was to try filling sheets across the county boundary, something that had not been attempted hitherto. A block of 16 sheets was revised and published, and the difficulties of revising a limited block like this were so severe that some of the work had to be published without areas. The result in some cases is such a mess that I'm surprised the sheets in question were allowed to be published. Eventually, when in 1920 it was decided that revision should be focused on towns and areas of significant change, the OS had to change the rules for area computation and do it on a sheet-by-sheet basis. Even had these problems not arisen, the idea of parish maps was liable to fall foul of some of the complications of administrative geography, complications that were largely tided away in the 1880s and 1890s, but which were still present in the era of publication by parishes. Detached parts of parishes have already been mentioned in the context of Kingswear. This parish had two portions not far apart that sat tidily on the same sheet. But what should the survey do when a detached part of one parish was wholly surrounded by another parish? Should it really publish the second parish with a hole in the middle? The other problem was parishes divided between two or more counties. Since different counties were drawn on different meridians, the obvious answer was to divide the parish and treat it as multiple parishes, each within a single county, much as was done in reality under the legislation of the 1880s. But life wasn't as straightforward as that, because of a prior decision to subsume detached parts of counties for survey purposes within an adjoining county. For example, the parish of Logie extends from Stirlingshire through Perthshire and Clackmannanshire to Stirlingshire brackets detached number 1. Here you have the portion in Perthshire, Clackmannanshire and Stirlingshire detached number 1, all of which were mapped on the Perthshire meridian. But you don't see the portion in Stirlingshire proper, which adjoins immediately to the southwest. In fact, you're not even told that the adjoining bit to the southwest is the same parish, because the rules say that if it's a different county, you just give the county name. There was another little problem with the concept. In general, when mapping an entity, there is no need to name the entity on the face of the map. The map's title suffices. For parish maps, the title tells us the county as well as the parish. The title also serves to tell us the county we should quote in ordering the map. These two functions sometimes conflicted. For example, the parish of Govan straddled the Lanarkshire-Renfrewshire border. It was decided that 25-inch sheets for the whole parish should be on the Lanarkshire meridian. So here we have a sheet limited to a single parish, but with portions in two different counties. The names of the counties appear in the upper margin so that one knows which is which. All very satisfactory. But because the sheet extends into two counties, it has been entitled Lanarkshire and Renfrewshire sheet 10.2. Okay, but if you want to order it, should you ask for Lanarkshire 10.2 or Renfrewshire 10.2? These are different sheets. In fact, Renfrewshire 10.2 is bleak moorland that wasn't surveyed at 25-inch scale, but the underlying difficulty remains. I trust I have persuaded you, if you needed any persuading, that publication by parishes was a really bad idea. So why was it done? The usual reason for producing maps of entities was that it fitted in with the process of surveying. But in this case, that seems not to be the case. The procedure adopted for surveying and for drawing the maps is set out in Seymour's history. The basic unit for chain survey was a triangle of the tertiary triangulation. The first stage in drawing the maps was to draw the chain lines. That requires the whole triangle to be drawn. Then fair drawing was started. Then the plan examiner was sent a tracing of a portion of the fair drawing to check against what was on the ground and to add names and land use information. We know that the practice on the 6-inch survey was that this tracing corresponded approximately to a quarter sheet, albeit with corners determined by the tertiary trigs. The process simply would not have worked had he been sent a tracing limited to a single parish. Indeed, at this point, the mearsmen had probably not yet been called out to show the surveyors the parish boundaries. In fact, as far as one can tell, the whole process of fair drawing was done on regular sheet lines with sheets filled to the edges. Only at the stage of litho tracing, i.e. the preparation of a printed map, was the work limited to one parish at a time. From a map production point of view, there was absolutely nothing to be said for publication by parishes. What then was the reason? There's no documentary evidence, but I think we can speculate. Almost 20 years earlier, the Tithe Commutation Act had been passed. To implement it, tithe maps would be needed for much of the country. Robert Kearsley Dawson proposed a national survey at 20 inches to the mile. He put a great deal of work into his proposals. We know about aspects like distinguishing different building types. I suggest that he or one of the senior officers within the Ordnance Survey produced a detailed specification for how the maps should be drawn, and that in the 1850s, this was dusted off and presented as a specification for the new 25-inch. I would observe that what I've described as these mounted parish maps would be very similar to tithe maps. The latter often have a table listing the various plots which occupies spare space on the map, and the books of reference were produced initially as flat tables which could very easily be mounted in exactly that way. Of course, these do not contain details of owners and occupiers, nor any sort of valuation, but the area information is there, and it will be easy enough to arrange the tables to give space for the extra columns needed if it were to serve as, say, a parish rating map. So that is my explanation. A specification for tithe maps, dusted off and used without proper consideration of the implications. So why do I suggest Scotland was different? I mentioned earlier the bijou parish of Kingswear and also the very small urban parishes of Plymouth. In Scotland, they were having no truck with tiny parishes like these. As early as 1856, the decision was taken to map Queensferry, about a fifth of a square mile, along with Dalmeny, which surrounded it apart from where Queensferry meets the Firth of Forth. Dalmeny also subsumed the Linlithgowshire portion of Cramond. I don't think any small urban parishes in Scotland were encountered until 1860, when Paisley was reached. Here, the Abbey, High Church, Middle Church, and Low Church parishes were all grouped together. However, the case can be made that I am not really comparing like with like. The mainstream work in England, contemporary with the earlier part of the Scottish surveys, was the northern counties, and these are noted for the large size of their ancient parishes. The problems of small parishes, I suspect, simply did not arise. The maps I cited in Devon were undertaken as part of a defence-related survey. I haven't looked closely at how this was done in the Plymouth area, but in Torbay, the military requirement seems to have been massaged into producing 3 full-sheet 6-inch sheets, which needed to be based on 25-inch material. Survey work outside the area of those 3 full sheets was kept to a minimum. Of course, this would have been really easy had publication by parishes been dropped altogether, but it wasn't, and the consequence was that some parishes were only partly surveyed. With complications like this, one can see that small parishes actually helped reconcile the 2 requirements. If it annoyed some of the civil customers, that was a relatively minor problem, and it lay in the future. So in this respect, it may be Plymouth that is exceptional, not Scotland. The other thing I wanted to explore tonight was the move to filling sheets to the neat lines. This represents the abandonment of the idea of depicting a parish as an entity, the abandonment of the dream of the assembled parish map. The first instance of this is Glasgow. In Glasgow, there was a single city parish, although this did not include the small Gorbals parish, which the survey grouped with Govan. Presumably because of anticipated high demand and the cost of hand colouring so dense an urban area, the maps of the city parish were engraved on copper with rouletted building fill. Interestingly, the decision was made to fill these sheets to the neat lines. That produced overlapping coverage. Thus, if you wanted the barony portion, that being a parish, say, of Lanarkshire 6.6, you could buy the engraved map with 1.5 square miles and dense detail for 2 and 6pence, or you could buy a hand-coloured map of which half was blank for 5 shillings. It would be interesting to know how many purchasers chose the latter option. This is, I believe, a direct parallel with the treatment of London. Incidentally, the Glasgow map is complicated by the later addition of further sheets to square the map. The first version was a thoroughly untidy shape. But what I'm really interested in are what I will term semi-completed sheets, those containing more than one parish, but not filled to the neat lines or the county boundary. Conceptually, they are an abomination, neither a map of an entity nor a proper series like the other scales. Richard Oliver tells me there are quite a lot in England. I shall show an example later on. What I can say is that in Scotland they seem to be exceedingly rare, and the ones I have found depart from the parish map principle to such a tiny extent that it is unlikely anyone noticed. Perhaps the most interesting example in Scotland is Perthshire 132.2. This includes portions of 3 parishes: Kilmaddock, most of the sheet, Kincardine, a slim strip at the western edge, and Leckropt, the eastern edge. It was published in 1864 as a Kilmaddock sheet, the Leckropt and Kincardine portions both appearing as insets on other sheets of their respective parishes. A small portion of the Kilmaddock part is shown on the left-hand part of this slide here, to the left of the thick vertical black line. The open letters EC, visible on the far side of the parish boundary, are part of Leckropt in fancy lettering, showing us the name of the adjoining parish. At a later date, that Leckropt portion was lithotraced a second time, and the transfer was added to the Kilmaddock plate. And that is what you see on the right-hand side of the slide. The name Leckropt in open lettering has been left in place, but 2 sterling against the road has been cleaned off. Note the untidiness where the Leckropt drawing of that Stirling Road meets the Kilmaddock drawing. That sort of thing is inevitable if you overlay one transfer on top of another. Note the depiction of the wood on the Kilmaddock side of the boundary. That, along with the rest of the Kilmaddock detail, makes it clear that there has not been any redrawing of Kilmaddock. Basically, it's the same lithotracing that produced the Kilmaddock parish part. When was this edition of Leckropt done? Unfortunately, I can't read the blind stamp. The fact that the Kilmaddock plate was still in existence might suggest a date not long after 1864, which is very early. But then why was it necessary to redraw the Leckropt portion? And why was the smaller Kincardine portion not included too? There is one other fudge on this sheet. The title ought now to read Kilmaddock and Leckropt parishes. However, rather than going to the trouble of cleaning off the word parish after Kilmaddock, the title Leckropt parish has been added above Kilmaddock parish. The next sheet to attract my attention was Aberdeenshire 2.4. Fraserburgh was published as a normal parish part in 1869. You see an extract on the left with white space corresponding to Pitsligo. The version on the right is filled to the neat line with Pitsligo detail. In this case, there is no Pitsligo 2.4 on the NLS website and no indication that it ever was published separately. In the extract on the right, you can see that the Pitsligo detail has been added to the existing plate with a significant registration error. where the road passes from one parish to the other. Note the artistically drawn boulders in Fraserburgh, which leave no doubt that we are looking at the same drawing, and hence that the new material has indeed been added to the existing plate. Whoever drew the Pitsligo portion didn't go in for big boulders. Here also the title was modified properly. When was this done? Well, in this case, the blind stamp is at least partially legible. The word department at the top and war to the right make it clear this is the War Office blind stamp used up to 1870. So these two sheets are almost contemporary, which we expect given that the plate was still in existence. Aberdeenshire 212, the next sheet to the south, also exists in two versions, Fraserburgh only and filled to the neat line with Pitsligo, and it's the latter version that I've shown you here. There is no sign of a separate Pitsligo version, which one would expect, had there been one, to appear as an inset in Pitsligo 2.8, the next sheet to the north, which has plenty of blank space for it. There is very little to show in Pitsligo here, just a couple of parcel numbers and a short length of road, so this would seem a really good candidate for adding to the existing plate. However, look at the wood to the right, parcel 327. Here you have the two versions side by side, the combined sheet on the left and the Fraserburgh sheet on the right. And you will see that the whole thing has been redrawn. Date? Well, in this case, it's an Office of Works blind stamp, so 1870 to 1890, but the date might be legible. I think it might be 1871. But the last figure is so poorly impressed that I might be deluding myself. Why was it redrawn? Well, I'm speculating, but perhaps the printer applying the second transfer for the Pitsligo portion sneezed at the critical moment and ruined the plate. The last of these odd maps I want to present is Argyll 15314, published in 1871. This exists in only one version with two parishes, Lochgoilhead and Kilmun, and no white space. It may be one of the earliest of the combined sheets produced after the parish map had been abandoned, but it's actually made up of separate drawings for the two parishes. You will see, if you look at the rough pasture symbol, that the grass really does grow greener on the Kilmun side of the fence, except that in this case there isn't even a fence, the boundary being undefined in the technical sense of mearings. I speculate that the Lochgoilhead portion had been drawn in the manner of the parish part and laid down on the plate. The order came down that parish plans had been abandoned, and the Kilmun portion was then redrawn and added to the plate. I say redrawn because this little triangle of Kilmun also exists as an extrusion on the next sheet to the south, printed December 1871. This one does have a legible blind stamp, and this one is also a combined sheet. And as you will note, the ornament is different on those two parts of that triangle. It may be irrelevant, but Lochgoilhead and Kilmun both have area books in two editions. In 1868, the intention was that nothing anywhere near the spot of moorland I've just showed you was to be surveyed at 25-inch. In particular, Lochgoilhead had only a single 25-inch sheet covering the village. In 1872, new editions appeared with more extensive 25-inch coverage. But even in 1872, Kilmun doesn't acknowledge the triangle of 25-inch coverage I showed you. It lies, in case you're trying to work it out, northeast of the Arabic figure 1. Loch Goil Head does acknowledge 15314, and the fact that the sheet included the Kilmun portion is a useful confirmation that the fair drawing of the 25-inch was indeed done as rectangular sheets, independent of parish boundaries. The dates of these two maps are significant. I have not found any Scottish instance of publication by parishes after 1872. Whereas in England there was a desire for tidiness and for uniformity across a county, in Scotland the change seems to have taken place everywhere in 1871-2. So my interpretation of these maps is that the order was issued in the latter part of 1871 and was welcomed, so welcomed that sheets where drawing had started or where part had been transferred to the plate might be converted to the new style. Why the difference between Scotland and England? It may have helped that work in Scotland was by now limited to the wilder counties, where a high proportion was to be surveyed at the 6-inch scale. If your 25-inch coverage consists of a series of islands, and it needs inverted commas because we're essentially looking at cultivated valleys on the mainland, tidiness was unachievable anyway. The other factor is the difference in nature between Scottish and English parishes. Boundaries of major English estates, in the south anyway, often ran along parish boundaries. Hence, having parts of the estate on insets on maps that were needed anyway might be a great convenience. I have the impression that this was less common in Scotland. Insofar as the great deer forests might do that, the boundary was mostly outside the 25-inch area, and both Argyll and Sutherland were noted for proprietors who thought in terms of whole counties, and completion of sheets across county boundaries generally belongs to a later era. So in this case, there was a difference, and there may have been good reasons for it. It is slightly ironical that the great advocate of the abandonment of publications by parishes, as Richard Oliver has found, was Colonel Sir George Leach, who at this time was the mapping expert at the Copyhold Tithe and Enclosure Commission, which, as far as I know, had nothing whatsoever to do with Scotland. So his advocacy was most effective in the country that lay outside his remit. Over the course of the next 2 decades, quite a lot of the sheets published initially in parish parts, and that seems to have been the survey's term for it, were converted to the new arrangement in which sheets were filled to the neat lines or county boundaries. What do I mean by quite a lot? And how can we find out what was done when? The big OS catalogue provides, or may provide, the answer. The 1894 one is available online, but the bibliography of OS catalogues on our website lists versions going back to 1862. The earlier ones are much smaller in terms of pages, but they seem to grow in proportion to the overall number of maps, so I presume their form remained more or less unchanged. Each county is presented first with a list of the sheet numbers available and their prices in coloured form. This, of course, varies from sheet to sheet according to the amount of work involved in colouring. Then comes a list of the parishes in alphabetical order, with the sheets corresponding to each, and again their prices. That second list tells the reader that if he's interested in Acton, say, and wants sheet Middlesex 16.5, it'll cost him 3 shillings. It doesn't tell him whether what he gets for his money is 1.5 square miles of mapping or a tiny sliver. But if it were a tiny sliver, then the list would presumably have multiple prices against Middlesex 16.5. In fact, such a position was handled by an asterisk, meaning that the sheet was published in parish parts, and anyone wanting the price should look for the parish they were interested in within the second list. So the answer seems to be look for asterisks. For example, the catalogue tells us that Hants 4912 was still in parish parts. And here is the Hursley part, which survived as a record map, so presumably was never replaced. But beware, the catalogue also tells us about several Lancashire sheets in parish parts, and since the 25-inch resurvey there only started in the 1880s, this is highly implausible, and in the case of the central Oldham sheet, can be contradicted directly from the NLS website. But it's worth looking more closely at this Hampshire sheet. Surveyed in 1866 and 1868, it says at the bottom. I think I'm right in saying that the Hampshire plans as published had a date only on the title page for each parish. This, therefore, has been added. And the reason we have two dates is that this is a semi-combined sheet with the parish parts for Hursley and for Otterbourne, but not for Compton. Hursley and Otterbourne have been added in the margins, and there is no parish name in the title. Parish names were removed from titles elsewhere in 1884, but in general, the marginalia makes me think this sheet was put together about 1886 to 7. In particular, you will see we have areas on the sheet, something that came in around 1885, and areas are also given for parcels whose number appear in the margin, which again suggests a date slightly later than 1885. At least, areas are normally added to marginal parcel numbers, but what about 493 in the bottom left-hand corner? It has been omitted. And from what happens elsewhere on the sheet, it looks as though areas were omitted when it was a bit of a squeeze to get them in. This is a botch. Now look at the boundary between Hursley and Otterbourne. Hursley trees on the left are different from Otterbourne trees on the right. What is going on? The key piece of evidence is the form of the two isolated trees on the right, one of which may be obscured by my face, but the one halfway between the boundary and the right-hand margin, it will do. That form of tree stamp is relatively modern. I think it only came in the 1880s. Whereas the trees in Hursley could all date from the time when the sheet was first drawn. What has happened is that a printing of the Hursley parish part has had the Otterbourne portion added to it. And I can't believe the Hursley plate was still around, so the result must have used a published copy and been reproduced by some form of photolithography. There is additional evidence. Within Hursley, note the way that the parcel numbers, like 499, print weakly, whereas the areas are perfectly okay. The difference in fonts, by the way, is part of spec. Within Otterbourne, on the other hand, parcel numbers are much firmer. There's an implication here that areas in Hursley were added to a printed copy that lacked them. Finally, look at that mirroring on the boundary. 4-foot root of hedge, almost overgrown by trees. Why on earth was the lettering positioned there? Answer, because it belonged to the Hursley parish part, and when it was stamped, there weren't any trees to obscure it, because these are Otterbourne trees. It would be dangerous to form any conclusions from a single instance, but it does demonstrate that one can have post-1880 printings of pre-1880 sheets which don't bear any acknowledgement of their actual printing date. And it certainly helps us to pose questions. First, what we have here is the photographic reproduction of a 25-inch sheet from a specimen of the previous printing. How far back does that practice go? What's the earliest instance we know of? Secondly, does such a process provide the answer to the puzzle surrounding the date of that Perthshire sheet I showed earlier with the let-cropped part added? Thirdly, How many of these English semi-completed sheets were initially created in that form, and how many arose from a fudge when one of the parts needed reprinting? And fourthly, to what extent is the apparent difference between England and Scotland a consequence of the ready accessibility of the Scottish copyright deposit copies, combined with a greater tendency for stocks of the Scottish sheets to last until the second edition came along, avoiding any temptation to tidy things up with a series of fudges? I can pose these questions. I don't have the answers to any, I'm afraid. But I hope I've persuaded you that publication by Parishes may be a nuisance to the map user, but the process has a history which is by no means straightforward and is not without interest. And if there's one thing I hope you'll take away from this talk, it is that a parish map was conceived not as an incomplete map, but rather in terms of its presentation as a big map following a different set of conventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. What a tour de force. I think forensic would be a fair description of that analysis. And I think as an inspector of maps for the payment of draftsmen or surveyors would be a frightening event in those days. But thank you very much. I'm inspired by that catalogue of maps that you showed the front cover of, because it had a part of a stamp on it which said Illinois, and it made me think: wouldn't a Scottish draftsman or surveyor suffer withdrawal symptoms if he went to America and worked for USGS with so many straight boundaries? He wouldn't know what to do with himself. Sorry, does anyone have a sensible comment or question for Rob, please, ladies and gentlemen?
Can you hear me, Chairman?
David Walker, thank you.
I enjoyed that very much because I spent a lot of time in the Scottish Map Library before the days of the marvellous website, trying to cope with the parish maps and the way in which different bits of the map got cut off just when you wanted to cross a boundary. So if I could show you half a dozen pictures, I'm ready to add to the quirks that Rob has illustrated so well. And I'd like to end up by asking him a bit more about the reasons for doing it by parish. Would you like to have a look at my screen?
Rob, are you happy?
Yes, delighted.
Let me just enable you, David, to do that. Just one moment.
I've got to click share screen, haven't I?
Yes, but I've got to permit you to do so. Let me just...
I haven't really got PowerPoint organized. You'll have to bear with me in PaintShop Pro, just looking at the pictures.
Just one moment, David. I'm just looking you up on the list here. Let's allow you to do this.
While you're filling in, I really did enjoy the list of grievances that Rob went through, and as I say, I'll add one or two more.
You're now empowered to share screen, David.
Right. That's as maybe. Yeah. Okay. How about that? All right. Can you see a map?
Yes, we can see the top of 5 maps.
Right. Yes, that's right. So we'll have a look at we'll take them in order. The first one is the River Dee, and the River Dee marks the boundary between Aberdeenshire and Kincardineshire, which were on 2 different origins at that time. And all of the rest of the maps are divided between Aberdeen on one sheet and the same sheet repeated a little bit for Kincardine. But this one was combined. So this is the exception to the rule. And they actually found themselves able in 1867 to show the Dee side, the Kincardine side of the river on the same sheet.
David, when you say 1867, on what is your dating evidence?
Published.
Ah,
Survey-
yes, it says
survey-
published, but
survey was probably 1864, published 1867.
yes, but how do you know that the version of that at that date actually included a cross-boundary portion? Were you able to inspect a blind stamp?
I didn't do that. I put my trust in Chris Fleet. Well, that's what Chris Fleet's got at the top of the map,
Yes.
and that's all I know. I
Right.
haven't looked at the stamps.
I mean, I understand that Chris Fleet's data in many cases came from Roger Hellyer, but I don't think we must assume perfection in all cases. All I'm observing is that it would be incredibly early to have a cross-boundary, a cross-county boundary filling.
But it was the exception, and it was a messy. Oh, the parish crossed the river. The parish was on both sides of the river. The parish was in 2 counties.
Ah, now what sometimes happens, it might this be like the Scottish parish I mentioned, where the both parts were surveyed on the same meridian at 25 inch. I mean, it's incredibly messy, but they do seem to have done it sometimes.
Could be, but they printed it under a Banffshire. You see the 4-5.
Yes.
Top. That is a Banffshire sheet reference, and they didn't have an Aberdeenshire sheet to cover that area at that time.
David, can I just interrupt to say Richard's got his hand raised. Richard, was this a point to make at this juncture?
No, I have got a number of points to make, but I'll do them separately.
Righto, thanks.
It's just to sort of get my foot in the door. I'll remove the hand.
Oh well,
It's gone now.
So
I'll know you're there.
if we go a little bit upstream to the west, this is the next sheet along, and now we go to the more traditional way. And so here you've got both sides of the river on is my pointer showing?
Yes.
Yeah. So on the right hand side, you've got both counties in the inset, probably 1 parish, 2 counties on that one. On this one, you've got Kincardineshire, which is south of the river. And on the other side, you've got Aberdeenshire. So they're split up more or less in traditional fashion, apart from the right-hand inset, which is 2 counties. And you've got some lovely bends in the river, which mean that Kincardine captures a bit of land north of the River Dee for historical reasons. Okay, so that's just to show that they could behave in 2 different ways on 2 adjacent sheets.
Which may be because they're different parishes.
Correct. Yes, correct.
What was the name of the parish that?
Banchory Devenick is the combined parish on the right. Okay.
Yes.
I'll keep moving. Now, this one is to show unequal treatment. This is called a combined sheet. And so what you've got is a chunk of uninteresting land in Cruden Parish in the middle of the map. And that is allowed to extend into its own margin at the top of the map. And there's one of Rob's crosses that I hadn't really known about before. And on the left-hand side, Longside Parish is allowed to be detailed, such as they are in this sheet. But on the other side, where you've got Peterhead Parish, that is not. This where the hand is now, that's Peterhead. So Peterhead is blank. Peterhead has to have an extension on a different sheet. So it is a bit discretionary, isn't it?
It is, yes.
So I'll keep moving. Because then this is one of the expensive maps. This was a 3-shilling map, and you'll see you didn't get much for your money.
Mm.
And that was Kirkcudbright in 1895.
Mm.
But presumably people didn't like that very much, because in the next edition you were able to get the same bit of land for nothing on the adjacent sheet. So they changed their minds between 1895 and 1907 about the way in which to treat this extension to the coast. In another case, at the south end of Arran, first of all they had them separate, then they combined them, and then they had them separate again. So they changed their minds twice in that case. And finally, the good news is that Ailsa Craig, if they'd followed the rules, Ailsa Craig would have been split between two 25-inch sheets. But they gave in, and very unusually, they combined they used their common sense, and but they still, if you see the numbering at the top of the map, they gave the map 2 sheet numbers in order to match the sheets that it would have been on if they hadn't combined them. So that's the good news, that Ailsa Craig you could buy for 3 shillings rather than 6. And that's just my contribution. Oh, but I'd like to go back. You can take my screen off now, Chairman. I just want to come back to the reasons for this, because in England, it might have been because they were accustomed to tithe maps, but I don't think we had any tithe maps in Scotland. I don't think we didn't have tithes, so we didn't have tithe maps. And I wonder, was it the English habit? They were happy to combine the 6-inch maps long before they combined the 25-inch parishes. And I would note that the lower end trig books were very much on a parish basis. End of my contribution.
David, thank you very much indeed. Interesting, and yet more permutations. Richard, you had a point for Rob, I think. Richard Oliver.
Yes, actually, I've got several points. I'll comment actually on one of David's points right at the end first, which is the use of the county to publish the 6-inch in England. That is simply following Irish practice, where the practice was to publish by county. So there is really nothing very significant in that. Rob asked whether parish maps were ever actually mounted together. Well, I can tell you they certainly were, because I've got here in a slipcase, complete with the area book, the parish of Kingsworthy, just north of Winchester in Hampshire. And if you'll allow me, I'll try and demonstrate what one of these things looks like approximately on the hoop. I should point out it's actually had to be mounted up in 2 halves, and this is a fairly small and very cluttered room. However,
this is live television, folks.
As you can see, this is the northern 2/3 of it, and you can see, I think just at the top, you can probably make out the names of one of the adjoining parishes. Not terribly interesting. The village is in the southern third, and if it looks familiar, the answer is it is familiar, because since, like most people, I don't have that many 25-inch parishes. I had to use it for my book on the OS in the 19th century, and after some of what Rob has said, I'm beginning to wonder if I'm going to have to rewrite it. Anyway, here is the southern half of the parish, which isn't quite so cumbersome, and it's rather more interesting as it's got the village on it. And again, you can see the names and the change arrows, which may have been a practice imported from Ireland. I remember the late John Andrews being rather intrigued by this. They do appear on Irish estate maps. Right.
Is there a title?
Sorry?
Is there a title with it?
Unfortunately not. I think they, the area book has a March 1870 print code in it. And it may be that they'd just given, either they'd just given up doing the titles, or the purchaser of the set decided he could do without it.
Right.
Anyway, one can occasionally encounter quite large sets of these maps mounted on walls. At Tinsfield, which is that Gothic place south of Bristol, National Trust property, which you need quite a strong stomach to look at if you're allergic to Gothic architecture. There's about 15 sheets, about 11 feet high by about 9 feet wide, mounted, I think are outside the billiard room, and I think the sheet in the middle is missing. It probably fell off. And I've come across occasional references in record office lists to this. I recollect that one of the Kent record offices, whether it was Maidstone or whether it was the East Kent Record Centre at Whitfield, I can't remember, has a mounted up set of the parish of Lydd, as in the airport, with the note either it's unfit for production or they need quite a bit of notice to get the thing out, which I think tells its own story. And there are quite a number of tithe maps which are about 10 to 12 feet square and which have quite often had to be cut in half for convenience, but there are a few uncut ones in class IR 77 in the National Archives, which are not normally for production. If like me, you've had to try and twist around to get the things produced, you can understand why they aren't for production. And there are indeed no tithes in Scotland, and the Copyright Tithe and Enclosure Commission, of which Sir George Leach was the map advisor in succession to Robert Dawson, certainly didn't run into Scotland, but as Rob points out, it's rather influential. It's not quite correct that there were no partial revision of counties before the general revision got underway. The Plymouth area was revised out of turn in 1892-93. The rest of Devon was revised about a decade later, and they actually re-revised the Plymouth area then. I can't say what they did about the area numbers around the side of Plymouth. Also, a point about tithe surveys is that the area of the survey was actually determined by the tithe district, which in turn depended on the unit for poor rating. And sometimes this is a whole parish, but quite often, particularly in the Midlands and the north of England, it's actually a township. So some parishes, although a township in the north of England may well be known as a hamlet in the south of England. And it wasn't always the case that the hamlets sometimes were poor rating units and sometimes weren't. Luton is actually divided into 6 hamlets, but the whole parish was mapped, and the map, I think, is a relatively big one. I think there were limits to the extent to which the OS would have taken over the specification for the tithe maps, because the OS treatments of buildings and woodland differed significantly from the tithe methods, and the OS did it by structure, whereas the structure of buildings, whereas the tithe maps do it by use. So the inhabited buildings are coloured carmine ideally, and uninhabited ones grey. So the balance of these buildings is often very different between tithe and OS maps. And also woods, it's done by the type of woodland, whereas the OS go familiarly by tree type, conifers and non-conifers basically. The tithe maps go by woodland or plantation, or even coppice as well. The Lancashire parish maps are slightly awkward because of out of turn mapping of a few areas, including Oldham, in Lancashire before the before the experiment around Clitheroe gets underway around 1883-4, and then the general resurvey of the, or replot, or whatever you want to call it, of the county gets underway in about 1887, which I think could explain the presence of these things in the catalogue. If I don't know if Rob can share his, I think it's slide number 27 again. I've got a comment on that.
Hold on, hold on.
You still have screen sharing, Rob.
Right. Now let's go down.
While you find that, can I ask Richard to hang on in there, because I'd like you to tell everyone about your talk coming up in 2 weeks' time.
I'll certainly do so once Rob has taken questions.
This is slide 27. Is that the one you meant?
Present, it's not appearing. All I've got are everybody's mug shots or names.
Have you clicked share screen, Rob, please?
Yes. Hold on. Oh, it's clicking share that I need to do subsequently.
That's it.
Right. Yeah, that's the one. You said that figure 493 appears in the margin without an acreage, but if you look at the top of the extract, you'll see that 493 appears there with acreage 2.445. I think the answer is that as it appeared on the body of the map, and there's this odd, awkward little bit in the corner, that's why the acreage doesn't repeat.
My apologies. I hadn't checked that aspect.
The other point about using photography for the 1 to 2 500, and indeed the 1 to 500, is up to 1888-89. The available size of negative wasn't big enough to use photographic methods, and they've had to use some sort of lithographic method. It's conceivable they might have used the anastatic process, which is a rather mysterious process, which was much touted in the mid-1850s, and then rather goes underground, and which may be something which students of OS printing need to pay more attention to than they've done hitherto. Well, that finishes my comments.
The anastatic process might also explain the somewhat more faded appearance of the Hursley portion compared to the rest.
Yes. But I do hope all this is going to appear in sheet lines, because it does take forward our, if not our understanding, at any rate our knowledge of the various varieties of things and trying to devise explanations. Right, that's enough of me.
Sorry, I'm busy talking to myself here. Thank you, Rob, for that answer, and Richard for all your points. Any other points? Ted Rogers has made several interesting chat remarks, if you'd like to refer to those. Ted, do you want to speak, or shall we just leave you there and look at your chat remarks? Mostly about origins, I think.
Hello, yes, well, Derbyshire, of course, is Dunnows, and Sheffield is York Minster, and on the moorlands you get obviously the usual white space on the county boundaries, but some of the, I can't give a date, I haven't got the information in front of me, but some of the Sheffield Derbyshire maps are complete with the county boundary running through the middle.
One of the things we need is a convenient term that distinguishes between completed, which NLS tend to use both for sheets filled to the county boundary, and completed or sort of super completed, meaning to embrace those that are filled across the county boundary.
Yes, and a similar situation occurs in the built-up areas to the west on the Derbyshire-Cheshire border.
Are you referring to copyright deposit copies?
No, I was looking at the, in the past, I've been looking at the NLS copies.
Because I am rather frightened by this discovery that you can have a post-1880 printing of a pre-1880 map that doesn't acknowledge the fact.
I think they're probably later than 1880.
Ah, right, okay. Of course,
but
Derbyshire is a relatively late county, isn't it?
Well, Derbyshire was done those from the start. It was Staffordshire that was the odd one out.
Right.
But as far as Orkney and Shetland are concerned, the origin is Fuller, and the entire islands of Orkney and Shetland are all on the same grid. But Fair Island, Fuller, and Fuller being the origin, this is why it's odd, are actually offset. So it'll all be got in one sheet.
Yes. Richard is probably able to tell us offhand what meridian the town scale map of Derby was to. Or are there any early town scale maps in Derbyshire?
Not as far as I know.
Oh, right. Okay.
There may be, but they're not on NLS as far as I know.
It's just that the merging of county meridians was something that generally took place at the end of the century.
Yes, well, the earliest for Derby is the 1880-ish first edition, and they are Dunnos.
Thank you, Ted. Rob, Richard's got his hand up. Is this another comment, Richard, or you're just showing us all your hands?
No. On the subject of the Derby and Sheffield mapping, Sheffield and Yorkshire is actually very late in the 1-2-500 programme. It's post-date 1888, and it's possible the sheets were filled. The adjoining bit of Derbyshire is much earlier, about a decade earlier or so, late 1870s. Now, I think that the OS 1-528 plan Derby, which hasn't been found, but which was also produced at 2-foot scale for the local Board of Health, was lithographed and has been reproduced, which was surveyed in 1852, was on the meridian of possibly the church which is now Derby Cathedral. It was certainly on its own. And there's a reference somewhere in Winterbotham's national plans to Derbyshire having been started on its own meridian drawing around 1875, but it was almost immediately abandoned, and none of these drawings on whatever meridian was adopted for Derbyshire, I can't tell you what it is, were actually produced. The combination of meridians seems to have been, for counties, seems to have been a rather gradual process. Things have been slightly misled, I think, by Harley in either the Historian's Guide or in the scripted manual, saying that it was done as early as 1862 for Middlesex and Hertfordshire. It certainly wasn't. It wasn't done probably until about a decade later, once, or certainly not until the late 60s, early 70s. And there's the strange Aberdeen and Banffshire combination. It seems to be a very progressive matter, and they only seem to have decided on a full-scale combination of meridians, and including the giant combination on the Dunnos meridian, probably about 1875-76. It seems to be part of incremental economy measures, and I think economy measures may partly be behind the combination of some sheets like the Kirkcudbrightshire sheet we were shown in the second edition. Something of the sort also happens along the Holderness coast in the East Riding of Yorkshire.
Thank you very much again, Richard.
Jerry?
Yeah, who's calling?
Roger.
Roger. Far away. Roger.
I was merely going to comment that NLS's word for is not completed but combined sheet.
Oh, sorry.
And they use the word twice in two forms. One is when the map is complete and the parishes are not named at the top, and also before that when all the parishes are, I think, present on the sheet. but the parish names are still there. So they use the word combined for that as well. Combined and then the parish names, or combined without the parish names.
Yes, which creates problems with that Hursley Otterbourne sheet I mentioned, because the parish names are not present on the sheet in the title, but it's only partially combined.
Right. Is that's in England?
That's in England, yes, it's in
Yes.
Hampshire.
I haven't got down there yet.
Ah, right.
Combined, complete and confused. Thank you, Roger. Any other points, please, for Rob? Well, I think the time has come then to thank Rob Wheeler. Why not unmute and give him a round of applause, and or raise a hand or click on reactions. But thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much.
A tour de force, as I said. Can I then, before everyone leaves, oh, Andy, oh, you're showing a thumbs up. Thank you very much. Before you go, where have you gone?
I'm top centre in my screen.
Richard, sorry, everyone moved around my screen then. Richard, would you like to tell us about your talk in 2 weeks' time, please?
Yes, all the little pictures keep on leaping around. I'm now moved up the screen a bit. Yes, it's going. I forget the exact title because I keep altering it, but broadly, it's going to cover OS maps, milestones, signposts, and other road signs. Some of you will be aware I'm a member of the Milestone Society and have been since it started just over 20 years ago. And some of this will overlap with milestone stuff. But whilst milestones and mileposts appear to be reasonably under control, I am not quite so sure about signposts. And all these things ceased to be maintained by OS in its large-scale database back in 2002. And I want to explore a bit why this might have been. I'm not sure whether I can promise you a gripping evening, but it'll certainly be a slightly different one. I hope it might inspire people to other people to do talks on similar points of detail. So at the same time, in a fortnight's time, 22nd of November.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to that. It'll be a marker, a milestone in our history. Your society, everybody, has just reached the giddy heights of 701 members. We've never had more. So thank you very much to Richard and Rob, who've given more than one talk lately, and it's added to the popularity of these talks. So if you do feel like giving a talk to your colleagues, either a show and tell, we can help you chair one of those. All the technical stuff is done for you, usually by me, and we have a little run through to make sure everything works reasonably well. So if that appeals to you, or if you just want to ask for information and invite others to do the same on a particular topic, please think about that. So thank you all for coming, and have a very pleasant couple of weeks, and I hope to see you here online on Zoom 7:30 on the 22nd with Richard Oliver. Thank you again, Rob.
Yeah. David Walker saying thank you, Rob.
Thank you, and thank you for your comments, David.
Very good.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.